In this video, we're going to cut brass in an unconventional way for the sake of designer beauty. Then we'll move on to building a beautiful set of modern legs that will eventually be brass plated for this second video, building a luxury walnut table. In part 1 of this series, we got a thick walnut table ready for its breadboard ends. And I mentioned that there will be a brass inlay in the top as well as brass plating on the legs. Those accents will be cut from a $1,000 sheet of 16th inch brass. And until today, I had no clue how I was even going to cut this thing. But luckily, brass is a non-ferrous metal, meaning it doesn't have iron content, which unimportantly means that it's not magnetic. But more importantly, it means I can cut it with woodworking tools. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I'm supposed to be seeing smoke. But let's just say maybe the mean commenters from last video are right. Maybe I'm just idiotic. Or a freaking genius. Because now we have a more manageable sized piece that we can clean up the ends on and run this thing through a job site table saw. The reason why we're using this small saw is because we don't want to build up a bunch of brass shavings inside of the main saw that we have, which is a saw stop. And I'm really starting to regret not having a blade guard for this saw because these brass shavings are a firing squad of sharp metal across my arms and face. So maybe the commenters are right. Maybe I'm just a big dummy because all I did was change into a long sleeve shirt and continue the process. Let's be honest, this brass has to get cut one way or another. And what better way to pour my blood, sweat, and tears into the project than pouring my blood, sweat, and tears onto the project? But to keep you in the loop of what's actually happening here, right now I'm cutting the panels that will eventually be on the leg assembly. And by cutting the larger pieces now, I'm left with smaller pieces that I can rip into the correct size of the smaller inlays. But those small pieces will likely get sucked right into the saw, so I need a zero clearance insert. And a quick piece of plywood clamped to the table does the trick. So now that everything fits, it's time to cut the strips. Which isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but I am realizing I should probably order a face shield. But thankfully that process is done and they fit perfectly. I definitely don't want to have to do any of that cutting again. So why in the heck did I do this? But no way, Jose, I am not cutting that again. So I'm gonna hammer this thing back in place and it will be perfectly fine. Especially since I cut it a little extra long so that I could square it up on the edge sander. I'm choosing to have the side overlap the top. And here's why. If I do a simple butt joint, then the chamfer that I eventually add will actually hide that joint. And like I said in the last video, the best joint out there is one that you can't see at all. So to cut these small end pieces, I'm using a literal push block and my bandsaw. But before I start the glue up, I don't want a whole bunch of epoxy all over this breadboard end because it would be a mess to clean up. So masking tape will solve that problem. So I'm mixing up an epoxy that I've never used before because it has a little bit more working time than 5-minute epoxy that you'd find at the home center. Although I don't recommend it for this purpose, and you'll have to stick around to see why. I just figured that the 30-minute working time of the epoxy would give me more time to get everything applied and get the inlays installed before it starts kicking off, which is technically true because I clearly have enough time to get all the tape on and everything situated. And although this is a pretty lengthy process, it still only takes about 7 minutes or so. So naturally I figure I have plenty of time. Plenty of time. But by now I'm starting to feel like something is just a little off. The epoxy is starting to thicken up and it's harder to brush on. But that couldn't be, right? It's only been 7 minutes and it's 30-minute epoxy and my shop's only 68 degrees. So it must be in my head and everything will be perfectly fine. So I know you're a proactive thinker and you're probably thinking, won't the thickness of that wood expand and contract and break the bond between the brass and the wood? And my answer to that is, it's 2 inches, baby. I like to live life on the edge. Well, he's saying the board is 2 inches, not his. Well, you know, 2 inches will only have microns of movement, and the epoxy should have enough elasticity to keep its bond, no questions asked. But by now on the second breadboard, I'm moving a lot faster and the epoxy isn't having time to thicken up. But regardless, something just doesn't feel right about this epoxy, so I'm running a quick test so that I can check the adhesion later. And while everything is curing, I'm clamping some cauls to the table to keep it flat since the breadboard ends won't be on for a few days. It's a new day and I'm excited to get this little bundle of joy unwrapped. If you haven't tried inlay work, it's incredibly satisfying, and I've even mentioned that before. But luckily the epoxy cured well, and let's test this piece. Uh-oh, that came off easier than I expected it to. So that's definitely not making me very confident moving forward. Oh no! And my confidence is not going up. And here's when I really start to question life and if I'm even freaking worthy. Because, uh-oh.
No! 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 No!
Yes, this epoxy says it bonds to metal, but it doesn't. So I don't know whether to say shame on me or shame on them, but either way, I have to test a new epoxy. And yes, I did scuff sand the brass before and it still didn't get adhesion, so now I'm testing the JB Weld 5-minute epoxy. I'm definitely going to need some time to figure out this one because the solution is going to be crucial, and sometimes I have to learn how to step away for a minute. So the best thing we could do here is just move on. This is some thick 3-inch walnut, and it needs to be milled to 2.5 inches thick by 5 inches wide. This will serve as an extremely strong, robust structure when it's all said and done. The ends need to be cut to 14.5 degrees, and when jointed together, it will produce the tapered look of the legs. One set will be short and wide, while the other set will be skinny and tall to mimic the legs on the Hellman & Chang James dining table. So the blade needs to be tilted to cut the short and wide set of the legs. Then I can set it on an assembly table to mark the correct height. This dining table is going to be 30 inches tall, minus a 2-inch top, which is 28 inches. And making sure both end legs are exactly the same length is pretty crucial here. So now you can see how everything will be jointed together. And with a quick check, all the measurements match the model that I designed. Now for the tall and skinny set of legs, the crosscut sled actually has to be set to 14.5 degrees. You could also use an accurate miter saw or a track saw. To get the same measurement as the other legs, I can actually use one as the template as long as I line up the backs of both legs. Then I can cut it to the correct length. Just make sure you cut the angles the same direction rather than opposing, because that would be a little silly to make that mistake. On this one, I can just use a stop block to make sure both legs are cut to the same length. And setting everything on top of the other assembly will help guide me for the correct length to cut the base at, since we do want both of these assemblies to be the same length. And this actually proves itself to be a pretty good trick, since measuring these things is pretty difficult. The proof is in the pudding. And you might be wondering, how am I going to get these jointed together in the splayed fashion that they're in? And it's actually a lot more simple than you'd think. First, by marking the centers on both of the base pieces. We want the pivot point to be in the center, then we can splay the legs as wide as we want them. So after pre-drilling both pieces, I can just screw them together so that they're one unit. This screws from the bottom side and it will never be seen. I just recommend not breaking the screw. Because then you'll be doing the helicopter for an eternity getting that 3.5-inch screw out. So lesson learned, pre-drill your hole big enough. And now a new screw can replace it and the story can unfold. Feast your eyes, for it is incredible. Now easy enough, with the legs splayed to the correct width at the end, I can just use a marking knife to mark both sides, starting off very softly so I don't catch any grain, then gradually pressing harder and harder. Now I can pull everything apart again and expose the cut lines. And I'm thinking the easiest way to cut this is going to be with the track saw. I can control really easily where I cut, how deep I cut, and how many cuts I have, since inevitably there's going to be a lot of cuts to get rid of this waste. And there's no reason to cut all of the wood away because we can just use hand tools to get rid of the rest afterwards. And on the plus side, this next process is pretty satisfying. And after a quick sanding block, this joint is perfectly fine for the next steps. I made the joint slightly tight so that I could just sand the next board to a nice tight fit. Then the pieces can be screwed back together again. And now the other board can be marked. And a marking gauge will mark the correct depth since this depth is actually more important than the last. The reason for that is because the bottom can be cut to an arbitrary depth, like 3/4, but the top piece has to be cut to a specific depth so that when they're jointed, the bottoms are flush. So the line that I made with the marking gauge is just a guide so that I know if I'm at the correct depth. And I can check and do any adjustments if necessary. Then the same process as last time will work just fine. And if the cards are in your favor, you just might get this one right. Some final finessing will likely be necessary in order for the two pieces to actually slide together. I'm going for a pretty darn tight fit as always, but I'm not going to be using glue this time. So in the future, if the customer's dog happens to chew up a leg, I can actually disassemble everything and repair it. I followed a lot of this same protocol when I was building my Gothic trestle table. So now I can take you in for a closer look. The joint is tight, but it's not too freaking tight, because if it is, it will be very, very hard to get back apart. And even then, we had to wiggle this one pretty good in order to get it to loosen up. And of course, along the process, it gained a few little bruises, so I'm going to use the trick you've all seen on YouTube, the iron trick. This concept is just using superheated steam to re-expand the fibers that were compressed. It may take a few rounds, but it literally works like a charm. Now we can move on to the joinery. I'm choosing to use the domino since this will be plenty strong for this application, but you can choose to use whatever your heart desires. Believe it or not, the stress applied to these joints is going to be pretty minimal because the top of the legs are going to be connected to the table and the bottoms taper in so they actually get forced together rather than apart. So I recommend using good joinery, but you don't have to go buck wild on this. And you'll just have to take my word for it, but I could literally put this joint together dry without glue and give it to the customer and still sleep at night. Both ends will get dry assembled now, that way we can add profiling to the legs later. And there she is. The second one is joined in the same fashion, although the way the domino seats against the joint is going to be a little bit different. You can see that the front of the domino isn't actually square with the joint, and that's okay, I'm just cutting extra deep. But here's where my goober brain starts screwing with me, because I think I need to put a shim on the other piece in order for the domino to sit square. But this is of course wrong, and the domino actually needed to sit angled. So here I am like a ditz, just trying to get this thing to go together, and gee, I wonder why this thing is not seating right. This is very weird. Oh. But shall not fear, the dominoes are here, and luckily I only did one joint, so I can just smash those puppies in, cut them off, and plane them down. And as long as I make sure that this surface is flat again, then I'll be just fine. Now, to do it the correct way, the plate should actually be sitting angled and no shim should be used. And if I did it correctly this time, the joint should actually go together like a joint is supposed to do. And thankfully, looky there, it actually works if you work it. Before we go gluing everything together, we need to remember to add the tapers to the two different types of legs. The wide legs get 45-degree tapers to help reduce the overall chunkiness and add to some of the pizzazz. While the other legs get a 20-degree cut while standing on edge. Just make sure you cut the right side. Cody has the honors of sanding all the profiles before everything gets glued up, that way it saves labor in the future. Some temporary blocks will be needed in order to clamp this thing up, and I'm just using the blue tape and super glue trick. The blocks were just cut really crudely on the bandsaw. And for the base, I'm just clamping some blocks to the side of it, that way I can work on one joint at a time. If you don't understand what I mean, you'll see here in a second. We're making sure to add glue to the inside of the mortises and the outsides of the dominoes, that way the joint will be as tight as possible. If this was just a tabletop and I was using the dominoes for alignment, then I wouldn't necessarily have to add glue to them. Here in a second, you'll see why these blocks are so handy. I can actually get immense clamping force on just this one joint without relying on using a large clamp and clamping to the other side. And judging by the gobs of glue squeeze out, I think we got plenty of glue in this joint. After both sides are done, the last thing I want to do is check to make sure that the legs are sitting vertical with the base. And luckily there's no skewing happening, so we can move on. And the other side is of course the same process, we just use a square instead of a straight edge to check the verticality of the legs. And there they are, those little devils. But thanks to the power of YouTube, it's the next day and we're pulling everything apart and giving it a quick sanding. Cody's checking those joints and making sure everything is perfectly flush. Now the assembly can be linked together again for the next steps. And Cody seems to magically vanish, so I'm left to my own devices. But no worries, because I'm not going to drop it. Nope, not at all. Told ya. The bottoms need adjustable feet in case whatever floor this table sits on in the future is uneven. And at first I try a Forstner bit, but it's just too wobbly. So a router and template is much safer because the last thing I want to do right now is ram a bit off the edge of one of these legs. The pocket provides a place for the foot to go, that way you can't see it from the top side. And I will link any of the products that I use in the description below. And while you're there, it would really help the channel if you subscribed. We have awesome content in the works and I promise you won't be let down. Or you can even go over to patreon.com/fortressfinewoodworks. I'm incredibly grateful for everyone that I have on my team. Thank you guys. The way we're connecting the legs to the tabletop is with C-channel, and the channel is connected to the legs with lag screws. The most important part is that the channels are mounted somewhat parallel to one another. That way they end up being set perpendicular to the tabletop, and one lag screw into each leg will be plenty for this purpose. And that will basically wrap things up for this video. In part 3, we will get the leg assembly inset, find a solution to the brass inlay conundrum, get some elegant brass plating fitted, permanently fix the breadboard ends, and get this girl ready for staining. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Please subscribe by clicking the left icon, check out all of our awesome build videos, and here's another unique video to watch.